The courtroom reeked of varnish and verdicts, everything polished on the outside, but stale on the inside. It was packed today, unusually so for a Tuesday. The kind of crowd that didn't come for justice but for drama. People leaned in with popcorn eyes, hungry to witness something, anything, that might go viral or stir a group chat. At the defense table stood a young black man, 22, maybe 23. His name, etched coldly into the docket, was Marcus Reed. But no one here cared about names, just files, just charges, just how fast they could get to lunch. Marcus didn't speak. Not yet. His chin trembled ever so slightly, his shoulders drawn in tight like he was trying to shrink from the spotlight. One hand gripped the corner of the table. The other? It clutched an old, worn photograph. No one could see it yet. Just the edge, a corner curling from time and sorrow. The judge, a silver-haired man with a sharp tongue and a colder soul, peered over his glasses. His name was Judge Alton Greer, a man who had never once whispered the word empathy without choking on it. He had built his courtroom like a kingdom, and today Marcus was just another peasant with mud on his boots. "What's the matter, Mr. Reed?" Judge Greer said, lips twitching with amusement. "Didn't think being arrested would lead to court?" The courtroom chuckled. Quietly, politely, the way people laugh when they know they shouldn't, but can't help it. Like it's safe to sneer when the punchline is a person who's already broken. Marcus didn't reply. The judge leaned back, theatrical. "I suppose crying is your legal defense today?" More laughter. A bailiff smirked. A woman in the second row whispered something, and the man beside her snorted. Still, Marcus stayed silent. But the hand holding the photo gripped tighter. His eyes never lifted. They were fixed on that single curled image, as if it were holding him together by a thread. The prosecutor, a fast-talking man in a tailored suit, shuffled his papers without looking up. "Your Honor, the charges are clear. Trespassing on restricted government property. Mr. Reed was found inside a condemned federal building after hours, without clearance. This is a textbook violation of Title 18. Greer nodded slowly, like it was all too predictable. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir," the prosecutor continued. "Surveillance captured the moment of entry. His fingerprints were on the main stair railing. There's no dispute of fact here." Marcus finally raised his head. Not high. Just enough for the courtroom to catch a glimpse of his eyes. They weren't wild or pleading, just heavy, like someone who had carried a secret for too long and was moments away from letting it go or being crushed by it. The judge was still smiling. "This is what we've come to," he said, waving a hand. A grown man weeping because he got caught. The laughter this time was softer, nervous. The judge had a reputation for sarcasm that bordered on cruelty, but laughing at a man who hadn't even spoken? That tasted bitter, even to the back row. Someone cleared their throat. Marcus slowly stepped forward. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for direction. He simply took 2 steps toward the microphone, then stopped. He held up the photograph. It shook a little in his hand, but he didn't flinch. "This," he said, his voice low but steady, "is my grandfather." His name was Leonard Reed. The courtroom quieted. Even Judge Greer cocked his head slightly. Marcus continued. "He was the janitor for that building, 42 years. The government shut it down and locked the doors, but he used to take me there when I was little, taught me how to wax a floor so clean you could see your reflection in it. Said it was a kind of mirror for your soul." The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. "That building isn't just concrete," Marcus said. "It's where he taught me work, discipline, pride. He passed last week, and I didn't have anywhere else to say goodbye." He looked the judge in the eye now, no longer trembling. "So yeah, I trespassed, but I didn't break in to vandalize or steal. I broke in to remember." Someone in the gallery coughed. Another cleared their throat. Marcus's voice cracked, but just once. I sat in his old closet, the one where he kept his mop and his lunchbox. I left a letter there, and a picture of us, that's all. No damage, just memory. Judge Greer's smirk faded, but he recovered quickly. Touching. But emotional context doesn't erase legal consequences. Marcus nodded. I'm not asking you to erase anything. I just wanted someone, anyone, to know why I was there. A long beat passed. Then the judge leaned forward. Why didn't you bring this up earlier? Hire a lawyer? File a request? Because people like me don't get second looks, Marcus replied quietly. We just get court dates. The gavel didn't drop. The laughter didn't return. Even the prosecutor was frozen, halfway through his next sentence, because suddenly the courtroom felt like more than walls and rules. It felt like truth had snuck in through the cracks. And still, no one knew what was coming next. Because the door at the back? It hadn't opened yet, and when it does, this courtroom will never be the same again. The courtroom was no longer listening. The judge was already moving on, eyes back on his docket, droning through legal jargon that sounded more like background static than justice. The young man, still wiping tears with his sleeve, stood silent. No one in the room cared why. Not the prosecutor scrolling through his tablet. Not the court stenographer who looked like she'd rather be on lunch. Not even the bailiff who stared ahead like he was watching paint dry. But then, the doors opened. Not with a bang, not with a slam. Just a soft, drawn-out creak, the kind old wood makes when it's been waiting too long to be noticed. Heads turned, slowly at first, a few glances, then murmurs. Then something changed. Postures shifted, eyes widened. Even the judge paused mid-sentence. Because the man stepping through those doors didn't just walk in. He arrived. He wore no fancy suit. No entourage trailed behind him. No press flashes lit the walls. But the energy shifted the second his foot crossed the threshold. His coat, a worn trench of heavy wool, hung off square shoulders. His slacks were pressed but dated, the kind tailors used to make when they took pride in every seam. His shoes, though scuffed, were polished, as if the journey mattered just as much as the arrival. In his right hand, he carried a leather folder. Old, thick, scuffed. The kind of case file that had lived through decades of dust, truth, and blood. He said nothing, but his silence did more than most men's speeches. The prosecutor blinked and leaned forward. A reporter at the back fumbled for her phone. Even the bailiff, stone-faced just moments ago, straightened his spine like he was bracing for a change in weather. The stranger didn't glance left or right. He walked slow. Not out of weakness, but because speed is for those trying to catch up. This man didn't need to. He reached the defense table and stopped. The young defendant, still clutching the photograph, looked up in confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper, like a dam inside him cracked just enough to let hope in. The man laid the leather folder down. Still no words. But the judge knew. They all knew. Elijah Boone, someone whispered. The name drifted through the room like smoke, thick with legend. He was the kind of name that didn't just belong in legal textbooks, it haunted them. A civil rights titan. Once the sword and shield for the voiceless, a courtroom tactician with the patience of a monk and the memory of a historian. He hadn't tried a case in over a decade. Rumor said he retired to the mountains. Some claimed he was ill. Others believed he'd simply grown tired of trying to fix what refused to be repaired. But here he was, in this forgotten courtroom, for this case. The judge coughed, cleared his throat, sat up straighter. Mr. Boone, he said, forcing composure, this is unexpected. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't indulge. He simply nodded once and replied, I'm here as counsel for the defense. But you're not listed as representation. The judge started, fumbling with his papers. "I am now," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm, clear, heavy with finality. Not arrogant, just certain, like gravity. No one challenged him. The young man beside him finally whispered, "Why are you here?" Elijah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time, into him, through the grief, through the shame, and said, "Because the world thinks it knows your story. I'm here to rewrite the ending." The courtroom went still. Elijah turned to face the judge fully now, his back straight, his eyes locked. "I move to dismiss," he said, placing one hand firmly on the folder. "This case was built on broken assumptions and paper-thin charges. The photograph in my client's hand is Exhibit A. Inside this folder, everything else." He slid it forward. The judge didn't touch it right away. His hand hovered, uncertain, like it might burn. Because everyone knew, when Elijah Boone brought evidence, it didn't just prove a point, it exposed a system. The judge finally opened the folder. His eyes scanned the pages, his face paled. "I see building permits, land titles. This is dated from over 20 years ago." Elijah nodded once. "His father built that house with his bare hands. I have the deeds, signed and notarized. The foreclosure? Illegally processed. The bank used a forged signature to push it through. And the city? Never verified it. Just rubber-stamped it because it was in the wrong part of town. My client wasn't trespassing, Your Honor. He was going home." The judge opened his mouth, closed it again. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, holy. A courtroom full of strangers, once eager to judge, now couldn't meet each other's eyes. The laughter that started the hearing? Gone. The smirks. Erased. All that remained was the slow, inevitable descent of realization. Elijah turned to the gallery now, just slightly. He stood there with a photograph because that porch was where his mother rocked him to sleep, where she waited for the mailman every week while his father worked double shifts. It's not just wood and nails. It's memory, it's history, it's dignity, and it was stolen. He paused, then added, not to the judge, but to everyone in that courtroom. And now, it's returned. No theatrics, no raised voice, just truth, sharp as steel, steady as sunrise. The judge, visibly shaken, leaned back. "Motion to dismiss." "Granted," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The gavel hit wood, and just like that, the case crumbled. Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk or pat backs. He simply placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "Let's go." As they walked out, the room didn't erupt. It fell still, reverent. Because some men don't fight battles with noise. They win them with presence. And for the first time in a long time, justice didn't need to shout. It just had to walk in. The courtroom was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for silence. It demands it. You could hear fabric shift when someone adjusted their jacket. You could hear the slow tick of the second hand on the clock mounted high above the judge's bench. But louder than all of that was the unspoken tension threading through the room like a live wire. Elijah Boone hadn't sat down. He stood beside the young man, Miles Jordan, that was his name, and rested one hand gently on the leather folder he'd placed on the defense table. His voice, when it came, was a quiet thunder. No theatrics, no legal flair, just clean, deliberate words carved out like stone. "Your Honor," he said, "this case isn't about trespassing. It's about erasure. And today, we're drawing the line." The judge blinked, then leaned forward slightly, his posture unconsciously shifting from superiority to curiosity. Elijah continued, opening the folder with the same care a surgeon might use to peel away gauze from a wound. "This young man," Elijah said, placing a hand briefly on Miles's shoulder, "was arrested not for breaking the law, but for breaking silence. He exposed a system designed to evict black families from housing projects under the pretense of redevelopment, a system funded by taxpayer money, and siphoned by the same hands that now accuse him. He began laying out documents, each one a grenade disguised in paper and ink. "This," Elijah said, tapping the first sheet, "is a lease signed under false pretenses by the Redevelopment Board. You'll notice the signature here, Councilman Darnell Hayes. Same man who pushed the eviction order on Miles's grandmother's home." Murmurs rose in the gallery. Elijah didn't pause. "This," he continued, pulling another sheet, "is a city grant, misappropriated. Funds meant for affordable housing rerouted to a shell construction company owned by a cousin of the presiding attorney. And then the recordings came. Audio files of backroom deals, voices of power brokers laughing about kicking out the riff-raff. A voice, clear, smug, saying, "We'll just pin something small on the kid if he talks." Trespassing's easy. The courts won't blink. People were no longer just murmuring. They were shifting, leaning in, watching the judge's face crack and reform with every new piece of evidence. The prosecutor stood up, flustered. "Your Honor, this wasn't disclosed." "It wasn't," Elijah cut in, turning toward him, "because corruption never schedules itself into the docket. You don't serve justice by staying on script when the truth demands improvisation." The judge cleared his throat, but the power in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Elijah walked slowly toward the bench, not to intimidate, but to deliver his final words with gravity. Miles Jordan did not trespass. He returned to a property that had been his family's for over 40 years. He sat on a porch where his grandmother taught him to read, where his grandfather died holding a flag folded in service to a country that promised justice, but forgot how to deliver it. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I stand here," he said, "not asking for leniency, not begging for mercy, but demanding what was always owed, recognition of truth, of pain, of people this courtroom has overlooked for far too long." He turned to Miles. "This young man isn't on trial. This system is, and today we've submitted Exhibit A through Z. Silence. The kind of silence that makes a man forget to breathe." The judge leaned back, lips pressed into a thin line. The smirk was gone. What replaced it was harder to read, part shame, part fear, maybe even something that resembled reflection. Elijah nodded once, then walked back to the defense table and sat down. He didn't look proud. He looked tired, like a man who had carried this truth too long, waiting for the right room to unload it. Miles looked at him, eyes wide. Elijah didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The baton had been passed not with a speech, but with presence. The prosecutor remained frozen, staring at the folder as if it might catch fire. No one spoke. No one laughed. The gallery that had once mocked now sat in reverent silence, because what they had witnessed wasn't a defense. It was a reckoning. The judge cleared his throat, but it sounded more like a cough of embarrassment. He shuffled papers that no longer mattered. His gavel sat within reach, but he didn't touch it, almost as if even that symbol of authority now felt too heavy for him to hold. He looked at Elijah, then at Miles, then at the folder that had split his courtroom wide open like a struck bell. "What do you say when the walls you've built are suddenly transparent?" The courtroom waited. "Charges dismissed," the judge finally muttered, each syllable dragged out like they'd been pulled from the back of his throat. "The defendant is free to go." No one cheered, no applause, just a hush that felt louder than thunder. Miles didn't move right away. He was still frozen at the defense table, shoulders rigid, as if part of him hadn't caught up with the moment. His fists were clenched, not in anger, but in disbelief. For weeks he'd been called a trespasser, a criminal, a threat. Now he was nothing, and yet for the first time that word felt clean. Free. Elijah stood up beside him, not with fanfare, not with swagger, just stood, calm as ever. He placed one hand gently on Miles's shoulder, a silent signal, a fatherly gesture. It wasn't, "We won," it was, "You're okay now." And that was enough. The two men turned and began to walk toward the courtroom doors. Elijah moved slowly, not because of age, but because he never rushed through justice. His steps echoed across the marble floor. And in that echo was a message. Remember this sound, because once heard, it stays. The bailiff, who had earlier looked at Miles like a lost cause, now stood frozen, eyes slightly lowered in something resembling respect. The prosecutor pretended to organize his files, though his hands shook, and the spectators, some of whom had laughed earlier, now sat stiff in their seats, staring at their shoes like students caught misbehaving during a lecture from the principal. No one dared to speak as Elijah opened the door and held it. Miles stepped through first, and just like that, they were gone. But the echo remained. It hung in the rafters, clung to the curtains, settled in the judge's robe like cigarette smoke. It would outlast the trial, the press, the murmurs in the hallway, because what had happened wasn't just a dismissal, it was a revelation, and revelations don't fade. The judge sat alone, staring into the middle distance. Somewhere beneath his robes and rulings, something had shifted. He had laughed that morning, not just at a man, but at what that man represented. Softness, emotion, vulnerability. And now, that same vulnerability had exposed the rot in his courtroom. He reached for the gavel, then stopped, letting his hand fall to the desk. There was no sentence left to give. Outside the courthouse, the sun hit different. Miles inhaled like he hadn't tasted fresh air in months. And maybe he hadn't, because when you're buried under assumptions, it's hard to breathe. Elijah stood beside him, silent, watchful. "Why did you come?" Miles finally asked, his voice still cracking from courtroom tension. Elijah looked straight ahead. "Because someone needed to." Miles turned to him. "But I didn't call you. I didn't even know how to reach you." Elijah smiled, just slightly. "You didn't have to. People like us, we hear the silence louder than the noise." Miles blinked. "So what now?" Elijah looked down the courthouse steps, where journalists were starting to gather, cameras in hand. "Now? You live your life, better than before, smarter, louder when it counts. And you?" Elijah exhaled deeply. "I disappear. That's what ghosts do after they haunt the right place." And with that, he started walking, down the steps, past the cameras, past the microphones, past the world that had long forgotten what real justice looked like. He didn't answer questions. He didn't pose for photos. Because Elijah Boone didn't need credit. He just needed the world to remember the sound of truth when it walks into a room unannounced. Back inside, the judge lingered long after the courtroom had emptied. He picked up the photo Miles had clutched earlier, forgotten on the defense table in the storm of relief. It showed a boy sitting on a wooden porch next to an old woman with bright eyes and tired hands, a porch that no longer existed, a home that had been bulldozed for profit, a family that had been called blight in a development report. The judge stared at the photo, then slowly placed it on the bench in front of him, not in evidence, but in memory. That day something cracked. Not loud, not shattering. Just a fine hairline fracture across the marble mask of the system. One case wouldn't fix it. One dismissal wouldn't change the tide. But it was a start. And more than that, it was a warning. Because now the world had a new courtroom legend. Not just of injustice, but of how fast that injustice could be unraveled when the right person walked in. It became a story whispered in courthouses across the country. About the black man who cried in court and was mocked, about the judge who laughed and was silenced, and about the stranger who walked in uninvited and left the truth behind like a signature no one could forge. Because what echoed in that courtroom wasn't just the fall of a faulty case, it was the rise of a reminder. Never underestimate quiet strength. And never, ever laugh too soon.